On November 20th, 1923, a German housewife walked into a bakery with a wheelbarrow. Not to carry bread home, but to carry enough money to buy a single loaf. By the time she reached the counter, the price had doubled. This is not a metaphor. This is not exaggeration. This is what happens the day after a currency collapse, and almost nobody tells you the part that comes next. Because the collapse itself? That's just the beginning. Currency collapse. Economic meltdown. Hyperinflation. These terms get thrown around constantly in financial media, but what do they actually mean for ordinary people? Not in theory, in practice. Not in headlines, in kitchens, in hospitals, in classrooms the morning after everything changes. This video will take you through the real aftermath of currency collapse using documented historical patterns, eyewitness accounts, and economic data from multiple nations across different eras. We'll examine the triggering events, the immediate consequences most people never see coming, the predictable patterns that emerge, and what history teaches us about how societies respond when money loses its meaning. Because understanding the anatomy of economic collapse isn't about fear. It's about pattern recognition. And the patterns, they repeat with disturbing consistency. Currency collapses don't happen overnight, even though they feel that way. They're the final stage of a process, like watching a building implode. The demolition takes seconds. The structural damage took years. Let's establish what we're actually talking about. A currency collapse occurs when a nation's money loses significant purchasing power in a compressed time frame, typically losing 50% or more of its value within months or even weeks. This isn't normal inflation. This is a confidence crisis in physical form. The triggers vary, but the underlying mechanics remain eerily similar across history. Germany's Weimar Republic, 1923, a nation crippled by World War I reparations, printing money to pay debts it couldn't afford. The government needed revenue. The printing presses provided a temporary solution. Until they didn't. Zimbabwe, 2008, political instability, land redistribution policies that collapsed agricultural output, and a government that responded to falling revenues by printing more money. By November 2008, inflation reached 79.6 billion% month over month. Venezuela, 2016 to 2019, oil dependency, corruption, price controls that destroyed production incentives, and monetary expansion to cover budget deficits. The bolivar lost virtually all international value. Hungary, 1946, post-World War II devastation. The pengo became so worthless the government issued a 100 quintillion pengo note, a number with 18 zeros. In each case, the pattern is the same. First comes fiscal stress, war, commodity price collapse, political upheaval, or massive debt obligations. Governments face a choice: cut spending dramatically, raise taxes, default on obligations, or print money. Printing money is politically easiest. It requires no painful votes, no immediate backlash, no visible sacrifice. So they print. And at first, it works. Bills get paid. Employees receive salaries. The economy appears to function. But printing money doesn't create value. It just redistributes it, silently taxing everyone who holds that currency. As more money chases the same amount of goods, prices rise. When people notice, they begin to lose confidence. They spend faster. They convert to foreign currency. They buy tangible assets. This accelerates velocity, how fast money circulates, which accelerates inflation further. The government responds by printing more to keep pace with rising costs. A feedback loop emerges. Each cycle happens faster than the last. And then comes the moment of recognition. The psychological break. When enough people simultaneously realize the currency has no floor, that there's no mechanism to stop the collapse, behavior changes instantly. This is the triggering event. Not a single announcement or policy, but a collective realization. What happens next is what most people don't understand until they live through it. The day after currency collapse begins, life fractures in ways textbooks don't capture. The first thing that happens, prices become meaningless. In Weimar Germany, merchants stopped posting prices altogether. They'd quote a price verbally, and by the time you reached the register, it had changed. Restaurants presented bills after meals, calculating at that moment's rate. Workers demanded payment twice daily, once at lunch, once at closing, so they could spend before value evaporated. This isn't chaos. It's rational adaptation to irrational conditions. The economic impact manifests in layers. Layer 1. Immediate scarcity. People hoard. Not luxuries, necessities. Toilet paper, soap, cooking oil, flour, medicine. Within 48 hours of the Bolivar's severe devaluation in 2016, Venezuelan supermarket shelves emptied. Not because supply vanished, but because everyone tried securing goods simultaneously. In hyperinflation, delay means poverty. Inventory becomes worth more than cash. Businesses that depend on resupply collapse first. Restaurants can't restock ingredients at predictable costs. Retailers can't know if selling inventory today means they can't replace it tomorrow. So they close. Not forever, just until clarity emerges. But clarity doesn't come for months. Layer 2. The savings wipeout. This is the silent violence of currency collapse. Anyone holding wealth in bank accounts, government bonds, or fixed pensions discovers overnight they own nothing. A lifetime of savings buys a loaf of bread. In Germany, 1923, the middle class, professionals, teachers, civil servants, retirees, were destroyed financially. Not the poor, who owned little currency anyway. Not the wealthy, who held land and foreign assets. The middle. The people who played by the rules, saved responsibly, and trusted institutions. Layer 3. The barter economy emerges. When currency fails, trade reverts to fundamentals. In Zimbabwe, teachers were paid in maize. Doctors accepted chickens. Rent came due in eggs or firewood. International currency, dollars, euros, yuan, became the real medium of exchange on black markets. This sounds primitive, but it's actually sophisticated problem-solving. People don't surrender. They adapt. The informal economy explodes because the formal economy can't function. Layer 4. Social structure destabilizes. Crime rises, but not always predictably. In some cases, communities tighten, neighbor helping neighbor. In others, trust evaporates. Venezuela saw kidnapping surge, but also mutual aid networks form. Professionals flee. Doctors emigrate. Engineers leave. Brain drain accelerates because skilled workers have options. The nation loses institutional knowledge precisely when it needs expertise most. Elderly populations suffer disproportionately. They can't adapt as quickly. They depend on fixed pensions now worthless. In Hungary, 1946, malnutrition among retirees became epidemic. Layer 5. Institutional breakdown. Schools can't pay teachers in meaningful wages. Hospitals run out of supplies because importers won't accept local currency. Police and military personnel face the same choice everyone else does: stay and starve, or find alternative income. When institutions can't function, governance deteriorates. Not immediately into anarchy, that's rare, but into paralysis. Bureaucracies freeze. Courts backlog. Infrastructure maintenance stops. The aftermath of currency collapse isn't dramatic explosion. It's slow suffocation of normal life. But here's what the data shows across multiple collapse events. Human behavior follows patterns. The specifics vary. Germany wasn't Venezuela, wasn't Zimbabwe, but the sequence repeats. First comes denial, the belief this is temporary. Then comes panic acquisition of goods. Then forced adaptation through barter and foreign currency. Then emigration by those who can. Then either stabilization through external intervention, currency reform, or descent into deeper crisis. The timeline varies. Germany's acute hyperinflation lasted roughly 16 months before the Rentenmark reform. Zimbabwe abandoned its currency entirely in 2009. Venezuela still struggles with currency instability as of 2025. What doesn't vary is this: the aftermath is always worse than the collapse itself. The collapse is a moment. The aftermath is the years spent rebuilding trust, institutions, and economic function from rubble. If you study enough currency collapses across different continents and centuries, patterns emerge with unsettling clarity. These aren't theories. They're documented historical financial patterns that repeat regardless of culture, government type, or era. Pattern 1. Currency collapse always has deep structural roots, but the trigger is always psychological. Venezuela didn't collapse because of a single policy. It collapsed after decades of oil dependency, corruption, and monetary mismanagement. But the acute phase began when confidence broke. When merchants stopped accepting bolivars. When people rushed to convert holdings. Economic collapse lessons from history show this psychological tipping point consistently marks the point of no return. Zimbabwe's collapse followed years of agricultural decline and political instability. But hyperinflation accelerated when the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe lost credibility entirely. This teaches us something critical. Institutions run on trust. When trust evaporates, institutional function ceases, regardless of technical capacity. Pattern 2. The people hurt most are rarely the ones who cause the problem. Weimar hyperinflation wasn't caused by teachers and retirees. Zimbabwe's currency crisis wasn't triggered by subsistence farmers. Venezuela's collapse wasn't initiated by nurses and engineers. Yet these groups bore the brunt.
Why?
Because they held their wealth in currency and couldn't quickly adapt. The wealthy diversified internationally. The connected accessed hard currency. The poor owned so little currency their position barely changed. The middle class, the stability anchor of any society, got crushed. This pattern teaches a harsh lesson about how nations recover. Recovery begins when trust rebuilds, and trust rebuilds slowly. It requires new institutions, new currency, often new leadership. Recovery isn't about undoing the collapse. It's about constructing something new. Pattern 3. External intervention or total currency replacement ends hyperinflation, not internal adjustment. This is perhaps the most important historical pattern. No nation has successfully fought hyperinflation by continuing to manage the same currency with slight adjustments. Germany ended hyperinflation with the Rentenmark in November 1923, a completely new currency backed by real estate and industrial assets. Overnight, the old marks became worthless. The new currency held value because it had limited issuance and asset backing. Zimbabwe abandoned its currency entirely, adopting the US dollar and South African rand. Hyperinflation ended immediately. Hungary introduced the forint in 1946, replacing the pengo at an exchange rate so extreme it's difficult to conceptualize. The lesson: once confidence is lost, you can't restore it with the same instrument that lost it. You need a clean break. A new beginning. This is why currency reform almost always accompanies recovery. Pattern 4. The social memory persists for generations. Germans who lived through 1923 remained psychologically scarred for life. Even decades later, surveys showed Germans held deep anxiety about inflation, saved more conservatively, and distrusted monetary expansion more than their European neighbors. This isn't weakness. It's learned experience encoded into cultural behavior. Trauma at the national economic level changes societal psychology. Zimbabweans who lived through 2008 still hold dollars when possible, still distrust local banking, still remember when ATMs dispensed money worth less than the paper it was printed on. This pattern reveals something crucial. Economic collapse doesn't just destroy wealth. It destroys confidence in abstract systems. And that confidence, the willingness to trust that a piece of paper or digital number represents real value, is the foundation of modern economics. Pattern 5. Recovery is possible, but it requires structural change, not just monetary policy. Germany recovered by stabilizing currency, yes, but also by negotiating debt relief through the Dawes Plan, attracting foreign investment, and rebuilding industrial capacity. Poland ended hyperinflation in the 1920s through currency reform combined with fiscal discipline and external support. Bolivia conquered hyperinflation in 1985 by implementing comprehensive economic reforms, not just printing less money. The lesson here is profound. Monetary collapse is a symptom, not a disease. The disease is structural: unsustainable debt, productivity collapse, governance failure, or resource dependency. You can't cure symptoms and ignore disease. How nations recover depends on whether they address root causes. Some do. Many don't. Those that don't often cycle through repeated crises. These patterns teach us that currency collapse isn't random catastrophe. It's predictable end stage of specific processes. Understanding the anatomy of economic collapse means recognizing warning signs before the psychological break occurs. So what does this mean for someone living in a stable economy today? What are the practical takeaways from studying historical economic collapse lessons? First, understand that currency stability is not natural law, it's maintained stability. It requires fiscal discipline, institutional credibility, and productive economies. When those erode, vulnerability increases. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent. It means conditions matter. Watch for pattern recognition in economic policy. When governments face fiscal stress, how do they respond? Transparent adjustment and reform? Or monetary expansion and delayed accountability? History shows one path leads to stability, the other to risk accumulation. Second, diversification isn't paranoia, it's historical literacy. Holding some wealth outside any single currency, any single institution, any single nation isn't about distrusting your country. It's about understanding that concentration of any kind creates vulnerability. This doesn't mean everyone needs offshore accounts or gold bars in a safe. It means understanding that resilient wealth is diversified wealth. Property, skills, networks, knowledge, multiple currency exposure, these aren't doomsday preparations. They're what thoughtful people do across the world already. Third, recognize that tangible skills and relationships become invaluable during disruption. In every collapse we've studied, the people who adapted most successfully weren't necessarily the wealthiest beforehand. They were the ones with practical capabilities and strong community ties. Electricians, plumbers, doctors, teachers, farmers, people who provide essential services, maintain value regardless of currency. When systems fail, fundamentals matter. Fourth, institutional trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. This applies to governments, banks, and corporations. When institutions demonstrate consistent accountability, they build resilience. When they prioritize short-term solutions over structural stability, they accumulate fragility. As individuals, we can't control institutional behavior. But we can choose which institutions we depend on and how completely. Fifth, understand the difference between being informed and being paralyzed. Studying currency collapse doesn't mean expecting imminent catastrophe. It means understanding how systems work, what makes them fragile, and what makes them resilient. Most people who lived through hyperinflation weren't financial experts beforehand. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. They survived by adapting rapidly, maintaining community bonds, and making pragmatic decisions without perfect information. The practical takeaway isn't hoard gold and stockpile food. It's understand how systems work, recognize what resilience looks like, and maintain flexibility in thinking and resources. Finally, remember this: collapse is the exception, not the rule. Most currencies most of the time maintain reasonable stability. Most institutions most of the time function adequately. The goal isn't to live in constant anticipation of disaster. The goal is informed awareness. Understanding that what seems permanent, currency value, institutional function, economic normalcy, is actually maintained through specific mechanisms. When those mechanisms weaken, risk increases. The people who navigate disruption best aren't the ones who predicted it perfectly. They're the ones who understood principles, maintained adaptability, and didn't over-optimize for a single scenario. That's what history teaches. Not prophecy, not certainty, but pattern literacy. The day after a currency collapse, life changes in ways most people never imagined possible. Savings vanish. Prices become meaningless. Barter replaces commerce. Institutions freeze. And ordinary people adapt because they must. But here's what's equally true: societies rebuild. Germany recovered. Poland stabilized. Bolivia reformed. Even Zimbabwe, after complete currency abandonment, found a path forward. The recovery takes years, sometimes decades. It requires new institutions, new currencies, and renewed trust. But it happens. The lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable. It's that stability is maintained, not guaranteed. Understanding how currency collapses happen, the structural roots, the psychological triggers, the predictable patterns of aftermath and recovery, doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you literate. And literacy matters because the patterns repeat. Not identically. Never identically. But with enough consistency that those who study history recognize the warning signs, understand the mechanisms, and maintain the flexibility to adapt when systems strain. The question isn't whether you'll face currency collapse in your lifetime. The question is whether you'll understand the systems you depend on well enough to recognize fragility before it becomes crisis. Because the day after everything changes, that's when knowledge matters most. If you want to understand what happens after every major economic crisis in history, not the headlines, but the real human consequences and recovery patterns, watch this next video where we examine the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis through the eyes of those who lost everything.